for the Southern California region. For Assistant Medical Director. Sorry, I knew I was going to botch that title somewhere, John. So I think now we can hear me, which is probably a good thing. But so welcome, thank you so much. Those of you who were watching, those of you who weren't, John was speaking on blockchain, and so we're going to catch up with him on that right now. So wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for your perspective on this. I feel like, especially recently, maybe within the last year and a half, everybody in healthcare has been talking about blockchain. And so just to start us off, what are you seeing from your vantage point? I mean, you're a subject matter expert in this. I know at Kaiser you guys are doing a little bit to get some things ready to roll out. But what's going on, generally speaking, with blockchain in healthcare? Give us some perspective.
So there are quite a few startups that are doing very different things with blockchain right now. And there isn't a single application that is taking the industry by storm at this time.
Okay.
And it's fairly typical of an exponential course for a new technology. Blockchain is particularly unusual as an exponential in that its potential is so powerful, and yet the startup, the ramp up to just get an application launched is pretty substantial. The reason for that is based upon the structure of blockchain itself. So the problem that blockchain solves is how do you maintain a secure, what's called a distributed ledger of serial transactions over time that is not centrally managed. So the fundamentals of blockchain are that it's secure, the data is immutable, and that there's no central authority. So there's something called a distributed autonomous organization, or DAO, and what they do is through a polling mechanism, they determine and assert the validity of a particular transaction on a particular chain, each block of which is a serial transaction. So the reason that fundamental architecture also makes it difficult to get off the ground is that if you're an enterprise and you're looking at managing a particular problem in a series of transactions internal to the organization, blockchain doesn't make a lot of sense because there's a lot of overhead in how the polling process works to validate that a particular addition is indeed a valid addition and the particular chain is a valid chain that you're adding it to. So you don't want to use it unless there's a condition where it makes sense. And the condition where it makes sense is where you have multiple institutions, either in the same space or in adjacent spaces, that want to collaborate and produce a reliable, immutable ledger of transactions over time that is secure and valid. And what that requires is that each of the participating organizations must agree to subscribe to the same design, the same architecture, the same rules of the road, the same principles, the same representation of autonomous identity, in other words, no identity at all, or an identity that is anonymous, or one where there's a very specific identity. So
let me ask you a question real quick. I want to just jump in there.
Please.
So because something you said just made me think. So, part of that, the first part of that was that everybody needs to agree on that same system, the same rules of the road. And I know that this is very different, but in healthcare, immediately I thought EMR. Right? So are we capable of even thinking in that way to get us all on the same rules of the road with a blockchain application?
It's a great question. The answer is eventually we will.
Okay.
The problem that we find with interoperability in general among healthcare organizations is that the diversity of the data types in healthcare, the entire human experience, is captured in an electronic health record. So all of the concerns about how difficult it is to get healthcare institutions to agree on interoperability has a lot to do with just how complex the data structures are.
Sure.
With blockchain, you don't really need to standardize on the complexity of all those structures because, for example, one of the biggest use cases that people are working on, there's a couple startups here in San Diego, there's one in Denver, there's several in Boston, is the personal health record. And so the purpose of blockchain in a personal health record is not to be a database that container that contains everything, but it's a serial log of everything that's occurred to you, and the data itself can be stored where the data was created, and the pointer, which is securely mapped from that transaction to that data source, to be maintained. So it's almost agnostic to that interoperability issue because it just points to whatever's there and however it's specified. And so it doesn't solve the semantic interoperability problem of healthcare, but it's neither is it crippled by that same problem.
Does it surpass it? If it doesn't solve it, does it surpass it?
It's an immutable layer of security without a central authority that sits on top of distributed data and is a record of pointers. So if you're seen in a clinic in Melbourne, Australia, and then you're seen in a hospital in San Diego, and then you have an email or a televideo visit with a former doctor on the East Coast, each one of those will be recorded as a transaction with a pointer to where the data was generated and stored. You would have the ability, if you wanted to store it, but blockchain is not an efficient data storage mechanism. It's the security, the immutability, and the distributed nature of it without a centralized storage. So you don't have to appoint your doctor on the East Coast to be in charge of your record. You don't have to appoint the clinic in Melbourne or the hospital in San Diego. You can be the custodian of all your own data with your personal blockchain.
That's like so empowering to the patient.
Exactly.
And it really actually has the potential to shift that paradigm that we've been talking about, is shifting where it's patient-centric rather than provider-centric or payer-centric care. I do want to transition to the payer side of this because I'm really curious to know, I mean, we've been seeing like fintech just eat blockchain alive, basically, and it's exploded. And so, and everybody, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Financial transactions make a lot of sense to have it, because they're already working in a ledger system, right? So it makes sense. So on the finance side of healthcare, I mean, GuideWell has a payer underneath it. It has a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan in Florida, that's Florida Blue. I mean, what can a payer expect from a blockchain application? I mean, what's the potential to disrupt there?
And so right now there's several consortiums in healthcare that are attempting to assemble different players in the payer space. And if you can imagine, for an individual who has a spouse who has secondary coverage from a different payer than the individual themselves, and that there's home health services that are provided by an outsource. There's a company that provides durable medical equipment that is independent of the healthcare provider or payer. And so there's lots of different people in the payer ecosystem alone, let alone the care delivery ecosystem. So the complexity of getting started is getting people to agree on which of the various ledgers that they're going to use, the so-called blockchains, and there's quite a few to choose from, more every day, and how are they going to construct it in a way that meets the needs of the entire consortium. So in fintech, the reason it's going more easily is for pure financial transactions, generally the amount of data involved is very small. So you can actually capture all the data within it. So you don't need the complexity of the pointers out to the source where the data was generated the way you would in healthcare because of the size of the data chunks. Like the human genome is huge. Like a spiral MRI or a spiral CT or a MRI with contrast are huge data sets you wouldn't want to put in a blockchain. But in the financial world, and that's why Bitcoin has been so successful so far, is because they're relatively simple transactions of debits and credits and dollars and cents and minutes and seconds and a source and a destination. And so that's a relatively simple, small, finite set of data types to manage within the blocks within a chain. Whereas in healthcare, it's so much more complicated. So on the fintech side of healthcare, it'll be just like fintech everywhere else. So,
I think so. Okay.
So fintech is likely to be the first implementation of blockchain at scale in healthcare, but it will establish, I think, a proof point that it can be used in healthcare, that you can get collaboration of multiple players in the healthcare ecosystem. And I think it will significantly facilitate the work of those who are working on more of the clinical examples. So I like to think of the personal health record as arriving before its time, because who wants to give all of their data to someone they don't know and let them store it and evolve for them, as opposed to having some control over it themselves and then being able to purchase services, whether it's decision support or any other service, that they can manage with their own data set. So I think that the early interest in personal health records in healthcare is appropriate and will ultimately lead to a sustainable model of how people can manage their own personal health records, restore some agency and autonomy by choosing where they expose it, how they expose it, and how they help manage their own health without having to rely on an external authority.
That blows my mind, because that really does